Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Henry Hale. I'm Professor of Political Science and International Affairs here at the Elliott School's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, IRES. And on behalf of the Program on New Approaches to Research and Security in Eurasia, one of IRES's programs, together with King's College London, the King's Russia Institute there, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I'm very happy to welcome you all to what I think will be a very interesting discussion on understanding political opposition in Russia, sources and structures of authoritarian rule and resistance. I think most of the speakers are, all the speakers are well known, and we are going to go roughly in the following format. So we'll start with Professor Regina Smyth of Indiana University, and then a presentation from a joint project from Sam Greene, director of King's Russia Institute at King's College London, and Graeme Robertson, professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so both those speakers will then present findings from their own research on Russia's opposition. And then we'll have perspectives relating to that research and the general topic from Maria Lipman, who is an expert on Russian politics, now with George Washington University here at IRES, and she's the editor of the new Russian language journal called Counterpoint, or Контрапункт, and I'm sure she'd be happy to talk with you about that if you're interested in learning more. The first issue will be officially out, I think, in a few days, maybe a week. And then Boris Grozovsky from the Gaidar Foundation. So I think it should be a very interesting discussion. I won't linger more, and let me turn things over to Regina. We've asked each speaker to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have hopefully plenty of time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank Graeme and Sam. No. I want to thank Graeme and Sam for organizing this panel and inviting me. I'm going to speak referring to research that I've done since 2011 based on interviews with protesters, rally participants, and not, I'll use my classroom voice, and non-activists, and the follow-up data we've done with focus groups, also interviewing with activists in the Navalny campaign, and then follow-up data subsequently with extended interviews with opposition leaders, and now finally a series of interviews with people who have left Russia following political and economic unrest. So I called my talk, as I began to conceptualize it, the surprising power of weak oppositions. So it's very easy to be cynical about the Russian opposition and to label it weak and irrelevant. And if you look at the literature on electoral authoritarianism, often formal models of competition in electoral authoritarianism don't really even acknowledge that there's an organized opposition at all. It's sort of either a sort of amorphous mass or a set of possible elite defectors, but there's no actual actor called opposition organization. And so we've been trying to think about what we could leverage by spending more time thinking about the role of these seemingly weak organizations that always surprise us, right? And so the idea here is that since 2000 or 1999, we have been continuously surprised as a community. And we've been surprised by Putin's durability. We were surprised by United Russia's durability, which now looks to be here to stay. We were surprised by the protests. We were then surprised by Putin's resurgence, and I think we should be a little surprised by the electoral outcomes on Sunday, because they showed quite a remarkable range of outcomes within control that is seemingly not the kind of payoff you would expect for the control mechanisms that were exerted. And I call your attention to Kostroma, where, while it's true the Democratic Coalition didn't do well, United Russia didn't do all that particularly well either. So they got about 50% of the vote. There was clearly falsification, but Kostroma is a oblast where elections have been controlled since 1993. So that's not an actually such a surprising outcome. So what I want to say is that what we have seen is a trend of volatility, and we have a tendency as a community to look at leaders and apexes and say, oh, that's it, that's what's happening here, instead of saying, why are we bouncing so much? And I want to characterize, at least part of the problem is that we're too focused on moments of democratic breakthrough and not focused enough on lower level evolutionary patterns. So I want to talk a little bit about evolutionary patterns within the opposition, within the state control apparatus, which is what we're calling sort of the melding of this idea of menu of manipulation with also the authoritarian toolkit, right? So a broader set of things. And I want to argue that we're in a very odd moment where we're seeing at the same time an increase in opposition capacity to contest and also compete, at the same time that we're seeing an increase in state capacity to repress. And while there have, and what's to me a little bit puzzling about the outcomes, and I'm sure that Sunday's electoral outcomes, which were, after all, the dress rehearsal of the mechanisms of control, is that how far the shift in the control apparatus had been, and again, how startling it was that it wasn't as effective as we might think. So if we focus on keeping the democratic opposition out, yeah, it was effective. If we focus on the bigger picture, there's some very troubling signals, and I'm going to come back to that. So I'm focused on this evolutionary mechanism of change that links state and society, and I think that one thing we haven't thought a lot about, and which we are trying to think about in my book with Regina is the legacy of protest for the elections and the legacy of elections for protest. That is the interaction between the two types of political behavior, right? So if we think back to 2011, we might characterize that parliamentary election not as an election because no one was actually competing for office, but as a protest. And it was a very effective protest. And from that, a social movement was born, albeit a relatively weakly institutionalized movement. And what's interesting about what was learned from that vote protest is that it wasn't the non-systemic opposition that said, oh, look how effective we were at mobilizing the vote protest, let's now turn it into a street action. It was these bloggers, right? So they sort of missed the fact that if you look at the story, they missed the fact that these people who went out and took this easy action of voting also might go out to the street, that there was a new cadre of people who might actually participate. And all these people needed to participate was a signal that other people were going to go out, and they would go out and join them. And one legacy of protest is the number of people willing to do that in large cities across Russia increased. And they are still there. And it'll be very interesting to see how many of them come out next week. And I'm sure other people have ideas about what that will look like. So we see in the data that we collected a core of protest stalwarts. And these were people who came out early and often, stayed out on the street, and really developed a movement identity. And they were also the same people who were mobilized by the Navalny campaign to implement the strategy that was developed in that campaign. So that was an important resource. There were also a set of people who had very different motivations for coming out, who were really just testing the waters. And these people were much harder to get out. They would come once or twice and not stay on the street. And these people were playing a sort of collective action game. They're easier to scare, they're easier to raise the cost of protest, and yet they share the same values as the people who went out early and often. That is, they're relatively coherent in their ideas, but they just have different motivations for being out. So that's one thing that we and other people learned about this. In response, both to the protest and to this Navalny campaign, and I think the link between the two. The Kremlin renovated its control system in ways that are very obvious to us, right? Reliance on cultural symbolic politics. But the most interesting thing that they did, and I know we talk about this all the time, but I'd like to talk about it in a slightly different way, is that they did what Ed Schatz recommended, which was to shift the political agenda, right? So he argues that a major tool in the authoritarian toolkit is to revise the agenda. And one way in which that revision was very important, at least according to our data, was that we showed that rally participants, pro-Putin folks, and anti-Putin folks largely described the problems in Russia in the very same way. But the solution was different. For the protesters, the solution was reform of the system in an evolutionary way. For the Putin supporters, the solution was Putin. And that's also true of the non-protesters. So the non-protesters, people who didn't go to the street, also their solution was Putin. And Putin as the solution was not, as much as I kind of wanted it to be, this mythical figure of Putin, it was the effective manager version of Putin. So they thought that Putin, at least hopefully, would solve those problems. So as the economy goes down, things look a little less than stable at home, turning to a political agenda in which he now becomes the effective manager of national pride and international security, revitalizes that idea of Putin as manager, and I would argue is at least part of the reason that we see an increase in ratings, very high increase in ratings. I want to just again refer to our data and say that it may not be entirely about controlled media. Yes, media is controlled. It was controlled in 2011 as well, fairly tightly. But what's interesting about what we see in our data is that people tend not to trust the media on domestic crises, but they do trust the media on international crises. So that the media has different weights. Sort of the propaganda over the media has different weights when you're talking about domestic and international sources. And so that I think is an important finding that speaks to some of this. So, and then on top of that, the regime adopts, in terms of elections, a very different and very tightly controlled apparatus. And we could talk more about that. Lots of other people in this room have quite a bit to say about that. Still, and here I'll move towards the end and let people talk about their data. In the election, we see a great deal of potential volatility. We see UR underperformance in some regions, in some places where they don't get to 50 or even in a few places 40%. We see some regions in which there are profound elite splits, so it's sort of almost return to subterranean politics. Among the non-systemic opposition, one really interesting and I think potentially important effect of this rehearsal has been an increase in name recognition of both the actors and the organizations that are involved in the non-systemic opposition. So they may not have done well, and it would be interesting to explore how what the nature of affect goes along with name recognition, but name recognition went up, and that's a first step. That's an important first step. So even in Kostroma, you see increases in name recognition of some 20 points, according to some reputable polls that I've seen. Okay, so how do we know what's actually happening under the subterranean states? Well, it seems fairly clear that winning elections is not going to be possible. So then the opposition has to be creative in its response to protesting elections. So the strategy will have to move again, probably, if we want to prognosticate, from trying to compete to contest. And so that elections will once again become about the process of elections rather than trying to win office. And you did see a lot of this effort in the very localized city efforts that were happening in places where the Democratic Coalition was very active. Let me point out the big gap for the opposition right now. This is a political opposition. It's concerned with political problems. It articulates positions on corruption, about roads. It has yet to forge ties to economic interests and economic concerns. So if you want to know what might lead us to not be surprised about success in the next round, one big indicator would be that this movement would start to forge ties with economic oppositions and economic movements, which would bring them sort of more apparatus, more organizational space, but also would bring them much more support. That's it.
Much prefer to speak sitting down, but oh wow, you can hear me. I can hear me. Get this up on the screen, maybe. No. So, right. This, what Graeme and I are going to present to you over the next, however much time Henry gives us, is an attempt at the culmination of something that Graeme and I have been working on for close to 3 years at this point, and that many of you will have seen presented, in some cases here, at George Washington, at PONARS, at other conferences and workshops. This is really the first attempt, I think, to try to bring all of this into a cohesive, we hope coherent story, but we'll let you be the judges of that as the afternoon wears on. I think this is a story that in many ways speaks directly to some of the things that Regina's just been talking about. But also raises, I think, some additional questions that we need to be considering. Right. So the story that we're trying to tell, or we think that our observations and our data are telling us as we pull it together, really, I think, comes in sort of these 3 points, one of which has 2 subpoints on the screen, right? One is that the regime's popularity, right? What we've seen in terms of whether it's the supposed 86% support of Putin, or the 2% support that, or the 90, whatever the inverse of the 2% support is, however you want to count, where the regime support lies in this weekend's elections and so on, is co-constituted. Right, that this is a process that does not begin and end with the regime going out and procuring a social effect, but that this is the process of a process that includes citizens, that we sometimes underestimate their level of activity in this process. Right, along with that, right, is, I think, our feeling that the legitimacy that's created in that process is very much situational. It's not inherent to the system, it's not inherent to Russia, but it's a reaction to a certain set of circumstances and stimuli which may change. Right? And that leads to the third part of the story, which is that this isn't forever. That there are challenges inherent in this to the regime in maintaining the factors of its own popularity, partly because, again, if it's not producing its popularity exclusively on its own, it is reliant on society to continue doing that, and that may become more difficult over time. We'll talk about why. But also what we think is the persistence of an opposition movement, right, which is something that we see as very distinct from opposition structures. And I think there's a conversation we'll need to have later about where that difference lies and what the real salient aspects of it are. And the question is not wanting to draw, not wanting to say that the movement, this oppositional movement that we see, and the opposition are the same thing. I think quite clearly they're not, right? One of the things that we start with, right, is a sense that the regime itself, that we're dealing with in sort of the post-Bologna period is not the same regime that we went into this history with. It includes the same people in many cases, but it behaves and it looks and it feels and it acts differently. And one of the key stories in this is decreasing strength of technocratic claims on legitimacy, right? That this was throughout most of Putin's time in power, a government that could claim to be producing or at least riding a rising tide that was lifting all boats. It could claim to try to be all things to all people in the way that technocratic governments often do around the world, and thus to represent the interests of all people. As that technocratic claim, as economic performance and efficiency really began to falter late into Medvedev's presidency, we see an emergence of a challenge both within the elite and within society, of people not feeling so satisfied with how this is going. We see steadily decreasing approval ratings, and one of the things that seems to emerge in reaction is an increasingly dichotomous approach to politics, and us versus them construction of political competition, in which the regime starts to claim that it represents not everybody in society, but only those people who support it. And thus there are some group of people that will end up outside of that line. Right? The other thing is that the things that we've seen in recent years in terms of coercion, something that we can have a debate about whether we want to call it ideology, but the emergence of ideas and identities is more important in Russian politics, and this international confrontation that we see increasingly structuring the political discourse in Russia is not the product of the post-Crimea world. It is very much a product of a post-Bolotnaya world, but it certainly begins well before Crimea was a twinkle in Putin's eye, as it were. I won't run through a lot of observations on that. This is a story that I think is very familiar to all of you. But I want to do say something. I do want to say something about media and politics. Right. One of the things that we find is that there seems to be a very real kind of relationship. We'll talk about where this relationship comes from between the kind of media that people consume, right, and the views that they hold on certain issues that emerged in the post-Bolotnaya period as wedge issues, as issues that again, we see this happen in other political contexts, including this political context, as issues that allow an incumbent to hive off certain parts of the constituency that may not hold the same ideas as their core constituency, right? So some of the things that emerged, for example, was this, after the Pussy Riot affair, this law on criminalizing offense of people's religious feelings, right? And what we find is that the distribution of opinion on this, from fully supporting to fully opposing, in the survey research that we did, we'll talk more about the sampling later, is very closely related to whether or not people watch television. Right? Most people in Russia watch television. Even people who are using the internet are watching television. Right? But there is some portion of people who do not watch television. Right? And these people have very different, this is the red line here, right? They have a very different distribution of opinions. And in this case, they are about twice as likely to fully oppose this law as anybody else. Right? Same thing, more or less, on the law on propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations, if we use the whole thing, right? That we see, again, a very different curve of those people who do not watch television versus everybody else, right? We don't see it so much when it comes to the question of whether Russia should take measures to deport most migrants. This survey was done right in the run-up to the Moscow mayoral elections, when Russia was taking measures to deport most migrants, or in any case, many thousands of them in Moscow and a couple of other places. And we do see some difference here, particularly in the degree of agreement, right? But we don't actually find anybody, regardless of whether they watch television, who disagrees with the idea that, or not many people who disagree with the idea that the rules on migration should be strengthened, right? But at least on those other two wedge issues, it does seem to play a very important role. The question, of course, is why. So we see that there's this close association between views and TV watching, but this is not the same thing as saying that television is producing this effect. Right? And one of the things that we know, both from our own research, but also that is backed up by our research, but that we know from media theory and political theory in general, right, is that people select into their media usage based on things that they already feel and believe, and things that make them happy. And then they select out of it if it makes them uncomfortable, right? So we find sort of two communities of consumers of political information in Russia. One that seems to watch state television and reinforces positions that either it already held or at least that the government then decided it wanted of messaging. But again, people seem to be selecting into these communities by picking media that are congruent with their personalities. We'll talk more about personalities. Graeme will talk more about personalities shortly, and their existing views. But it is worth noting that until the government brought it up, most of these things, most of these issues on homosexuality, on the rights of religious believers, were not really a big part of the Russian political discourse. Right? Moving on to the opposition. Right? Look at the data that underpins this in a moment, but we find three headline points, right? And in talking about the opposition, what we're again talking about is this movement that emerges in the post-Bolotnaya period. And one of the things we wanted to look at in the ensuing years is, does it disappear? We might expect, in the face of coercion, in the face of marginalization ideologically, that it would begin to disappear. And certainly if you focus on the organizational structures, some of the structures, the movement organizations that came up in the Bolotnaya moment, we do see it begin to fade. But actually what we seem to see over time is that the movement retains a tremendous ability to mobilize people, to mobilize around ideas, to mobilize around events, particularly around events. But that power resides not in structures, not in organizations, and not in individuals, but in frames. Right? In explanatory frameworks, in sets of ideas and interpretations that make people angry in the face of a certain political or other kind of event or happening. Right? We see significant movement and fluidity of individuals and ideas across parts of the movement, right? Across organizations, across iterations of protests. So we see the terms, the ideas, the frames again that are being used from one moment to another, from one year to another, becoming increasingly similar. So we seem to have what looks like kind of a network of networks in which the overall sort of ecosystem of these organizations and of these movements seems to be much more important than any of the individual organizations and relationships themselves. Right? And we do see a growing coherence and consistency of anti-regime framing compared to the pre-Bolotnaya period. Right? So where do we find this? We started by looking primarily at online social media, not as an object of study, but as a way of studying the movement itself. And we sort of refer to this as data-intensive process tracing. We're looking at the relationships of things that are moving through this data to try to piece out a story of what's going on. So we do a series of event-based studies, which allows us to tie together both online and offline observations, so we can see what seems to be relating to what. We recognize, of course, that online data are not a perfect reflection of the movement, but they allow us to ask and begin to answer some other questions. And this is based on a sample of about 17,000 participants from 18 public Facebook protest groups. We talk about how the groups were selected if you have questions. I don't want to spend time on that now. Arranged in sort of 7 snapshots of the network between 2012 and 2015, ending in August of this year, so really up to almost right now, right? And this is hard to see. This is essentially what we're looking at, right? So this is what the network, the protest network, looks like on the 2nd and 3rd of March 2012, right? The 4th of March was the presidential election, so this is the peak mobilizational moment for people who wanted to have an impact on what was going to happen with this election that year. Everybody knew he was going to win, but nobody was this contingent was terribly happy about it, right? This is what the movement looks like when you bring together all of the data that we collected in the ensuing 3 years. Right? Again, we don't capture the periods between the waves, but we do. We are able to bring them together to see what the general structure looks like over time. Right. So if you look at the sort of the March 2002 movement, right, we said this huge grouping over here. This is a community online called We Believe in the Bolotnaya Площади. We were on Bolotnaya Square and we will be back. Right. if you look over at this map, you can find that group way up here, right? The largest group here is a group called Мы против вмешательства в внутренние дела Украины. We're against interference in Ukraine's internal affairs, right? So the question we wanted to ask was how we get from here to there and what we learned from that process, right? This is what it looks like in terms of numbers, and this is, I think, the first surprise in the story, right? So in this network, which we think captures the vast majority of activity going on at any given time, right? We find that on 2nd and 3rd of March 2012, we had about 2,000 people active in the network, right? So you would have thought of that as a peak, right? You would have thought that the network should have, in terms of what we're reading in the newspapers and talking to people, begun to go into abeyance, begin to go into decline. And yet we find that the next time we return to the network on the 5th and 7th of July 2014, right? We've got almost 6,000 people active in the network. Right? The vast majority of those people are in the anti-war community. Right? That goes up considerably, up to just over 8,000 in the next wave in September 21st, 22nd, 2014. September 21st was the Peace March in Moscow and St. Petersburg, right? Notably, we've got about 8,000 people online in the network, right? But we've got about 75,000 people out on the streets in Russia, about 50,000 we think in Moscow, and 25,000 probably in St. Petersburg, right? So there has been this traditional argument that we have slacktivism, right? That we have more people coming out online. It doesn't seem at first glance to be what we're seeing, right? We're actually seeing more people coming out on the streets where it might actually be safer. Because if you click online, right, we don't know how many people are reading. This is based on people who are liking, sharing, posting, commenting, that sort of thing. That leaves a mark, right? And the government is unable to find you if they want to, which we know that they did, particularly in the May 6th Bolotna investigations, right? Whereas if you come out in the streets and there are a few thousand other people there, you might actually be more anonymous. But that's a hypothesis we need to take up further, right? Then, of course, we do see it come down. The next wave is the 27th to 28th of February. The 27th of February 2015 is the day that Nemtsov was killed in Moscow. Right. We then come back again and look later on the 1st and 2nd of March 2015, which is the march was supposed to be the spring march in Moscow against Putin's policies, but it turns into a memorial march for Nemtsov. Right. And then again the 5th and 7th of July 2015, which we expected to be a quiet period, but which reflects a lot of mobilization, particularly in sort of the Navalny camp ahead of the upcoming elections. So we won't go through this in detail, but what you see is a lot of movement in terms of where movement activity seems to be at any given time. Right? You don't see any organization that seems to be a central sort of locus of mobilizing activity throughout this period, right? It starts very much in sort of the Bolotny groups, it then moves into the anti-war movement, it then moves throughout some of the political parties, ends up with Navalny, but I think that there's no reason to believe that that is then the trend that we're on. Like the likelihood is, if we were to collect this data 2 months from now, we would see a very different structure again, right? Look at this, if you see how the anti-war network itself came to be and where people were coming from. Only about, at least in our sample, 1% of the people who we found in the anti-war movement had been in the Bolotny movement before, right? In the first wave, where we found that about 99% of the people in the anti-war movement, again, had never shown up in our data before. Now, our data are limited, so they may have been involved before, in other ways, but certainly the vast majority seem to have been new. Now that recruiting power declines over time, right? But we find, I don't put it all up on the screen, but we find that when the Navalny campaign heats up, we find very much the same thing, that they're bringing in more people, right? New people who hadn't been involved before. So the movement seems to maintain, although with different organizational structures, the ability to keep bringing in new people, not something you would expect from a movement in decline or in abeyance necessarily, right? Skip that. the last point, right? In this summer, we saw two protest movements, small-scale protest movements emerge in Moscow around parks. Right, one at Tarfyanka in Lasinny Ostrov Park up in northeastern Moscow, and one at in Park Druzhby at Rishnoy Vokzal in northwestern Moscow, across the street from my apartment. These were protests against construction that the local residents didn't want to see happen in their park. In one case, a church. In other places, it's not actually clear what they're going to be building, but somebody's building something. You see localized protest groups that seem to be drawing in new people, mostly local residents, right? You see some, this is sort of what the network map looks like within these groups for the period of July and August of this year, right? Not a huge amount of activity, some sharing though, so you do see communication between, say, the Tarfyanka people and the Park Druzhby people. But interestingly, what you see if you read through this is framing that is almost indistinguishable from the Bolotnaya movement framing, from the Navalny group's framing, right? Whereas in the past, if you looked at these kinds of not in my backyard movements that you really had in Russia since at least the 2000s, the early 2000s, is that most of those movements and historically would have not wanted to get anywhere near opposition groups. They would not have wanted to get anywhere near politicians, and at some point in their history, they probably would have written a petition to Putin asking him to intercede, right? These people don't do that, right? They invite Navalny, particularly because Navalny brings lawyers, right? But they invite people who have the experience of mobilization and dealing with the police and dealing with local governments in, right? They invited anybody who they think is a sympathizer. They adopt, again, the same framing and explanatory frameworks about, the party of swindlers and thieves and things like that, right? But they very clearly see the regime, certainly United Russia, and in most cases Putin, as part of the problem and not an eventual part of the solution. We think that represents both a very real shift from the pre-Bolotnaya period, but also says something about the durability of this movement as a whole, right? It is inserting frames, inserting understandings of how politics works in Russia into communities where it wouldn't otherwise have been. And with that, I will hand over to Graeme.
So as Sam mentioned, we've been working on this for 3 years, so we managed to come up with more than one story to tell. And part of the job now is to try and kind of put it all back into one story. So I'm going to focus on a different part of the story, different stream of research that we've been doing. But I think that is quite consonant with some of these things that Sam just talked about and add some other dimensions too. One of the things that struck observers and people doing sociological surveys of the protesters around the time of the Bolotnaya movement was that there was a significant difference between the social makeup of the population at large and the social makeup of the people of the protesters. Yes, there was people from all sorts of parts of society there, but on average, people in the protests tended to be more educated, they tend to be wealthier, they tended to get their information more from online sources rather than television, and they tended to be more urban than the population at large. This actually, in comparative perspective, is true in authoritarian regimes around the world, where authoritarians now face more of a threat, usually from educated urbanites, than they do from the kind of classical revolutions that come from peasant uprisings or urban workers. So this is, in this sense, Russia fits very clearly into a broader pattern. So what we wanted to do was to find out, okay, so we know that there's these protesters that are urban and educated on the streets. There's also lots of urban and educated people who are not on the streets. So can we get a sense of how deep and how wide the disenchantment that we're seeing actually is in this demographic? And then can we understand better what are the factors that shape the patterns across this key group? And so what we did was we started doing a bunch of surveys. We did online surveys where you, in order to select in, you had to have some university education, kind of middle class income, and to be on an online survey or online. So that's helpful. And we did a series of them going back to around the presidential elections in 2012 up until July 2014. And what we found was that in each of these surveys, and I'm going to focus particularly on October 2013, and then for obvious reasons, July 2014, what we found was that initially, at least, this group of educated urbanites was different from the rest of the population. Support for Putin measured in all sorts of different ways here. This is just a kind of map of voting intentions, but in all sorts of different dimensions, these people were different from the population at large. And so we wanted to understand why that was, and then when we reran a survey, and I'll say how we did that in July 2014, after Crimea, all of a sudden they're not different at all. And they look very, very, very similar to the population at large. So I want to explain sort of this pattern here of support and non-support, and then explain why you get this big rallying effect later on. So to cut a very long story short, I'm going to just give you some of the highlights of what we found. And if you want to know more about how we found it and what the underlying data look like, I'm happy to talk about that. But essentially we found a number of sort of classical features that are kind of well known in the literature that people have talked about a lot, and we found out that they were a pretty good guide to a certain extent in understanding patterns of support and opposition amongst our educated urbanites. We found, for example, that people who were doing better economically tended to support the regime more. This is the classic Dan Treisman finding that we've all kind of known in our hearts for a very long time, and it's easy to see in the data up to a certain point. I'll come back to that later. We found that public sector workers tend to be more supportive of the regime. Again, no surprise there. And we found that older people, pensioners, tended to be more supportive of the regime. Again, not much of a surprise there. And we found that to a certain extent, depending on how you measure it, women tended to be more supportive of the regime, although it varies across different kinds of measures. So far, so standard story. But in these surveys, we tried a lot of different ways of trying to understand why people who were similarly socioeconomically located actually had quite different and often like really mutually contradictory and opposing positions. And one thing that we dug into was an enormous literature in psychology, in social psychology, which looks at the role of people's personalities on outcomes in their lives. And psychologists have shown over 50 years or more of research now that there are a number of identifying personality traits. Personality traits are sort of things that you acquire partly through genetics and then early childhood experiences that characterize your outlook on life and your interpretation of your experience for the rest of your life, and they change very little over time. And psychologists have connected these things to everything from how long you're likely to live, to how sick you're going to get, to how you're going to respond to being sick, to whether you're going to get married, to what kind of job you're going to do, to how well you're going to do in that job, to whether you're going to go to prison. And then political scientists finally thought, well, maybe this has got something to do with politics too. And there's been a recent work in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, especially in the United States, but also in Western Europe, looking at the connection between people's personality and how they interact with politics and understand politics. And there's basically 2 personality traits that come out in every single one of these studies in democracies about about the relationship between these two spheres. And one is that people who are open to new ideas, open to new experiences, tend to be more liberal, right? And people who are concerned with details and concerned with order tend to be more conservative, right? This makes a certain amount of intuitive sense. So we asked Russians asked our online urbanites the same kinds of questions as Western social scientists have been doing, and we found something completely different, right? We didn't find that openness to experience or ideas was particularly important, nor did we find this kind of attention to detail to matter all that consistently. What we found was something different that doesn't matter in Western politics matter the most, and that is a desire for social acceptance. People who really value social acceptance, who value fitting in, were much more likely to be more supportive of President Putin. They were more likely to watch state television. They were more committed to the Orthodox Church. They were more likely to be homophobic. They were more likely to be willing to sacrifice freedom for order. In other words, a whole range of positions that fit with support for regime depend very heavily on this desire for social acceptance. And this is an effect that's huge, and you can't make it go away in any of the data. And I think this is extremely important. What we think here is what we're seeing is that one of the central supports of popular legitimacy for the regime is highly situational, and that it depends on people's perceptions of what the appropriate and non-wave-making form of behavior is. And when that perspective of appropriateness changes, so their attitudes on all of these other regime positions that are listed on the screen is likely to change too. In other words, these deep personality traits that they have their whole life, the relationship between that and politics is situational and could change very rapidly. This is very much along the lines of the image that comes to my mind when I think about this, is Václav Havel's work on the power of the powerless. The idea of the need for, in his case, totalitarian regimes to maintain an appearance of unanimity. And when that appearance of unanimity goes, the regime disappears overnight and we're all surprised by it. And I think what we see here in Russia today is that a lot of the support that we're seeing for Putin is not a mistake, it's not a surveying error, but it is something that could go away very quickly if the context and the need for unanimity changes. So that was the situation in October 2013, and of course we get Yanukovych gets overthrown, Crimea gets annexed, war happens in Ukraine, and we see nationally this huge support for the president increase, a huge sort of emotional wave sweep across the country that would have been unexpected before. And so what we did was decided to go back and re-interview our respondents from before and see what happened to them. And we tried what's called a panel design. We basically recontacted the same individuals that we had asked questions of before, and then we asked them similar sets of questions again. And this allows you to get a real causal leverage on, okay, what has it actually changed to make your opinion move. And what we found, first of all, was that our educated urbanites had moved. Our educated urbanites had moved dramatically. And support for, so the dark blue columns are, this is the approval for Putin on a 1 to 4 scale, the standard Levada question. The dark blue is October 2013, the light blue is from July 2014. And what we see is that support for approval of Putin goes up from somewhere around 50%, which is below the considered below the national polls, to over 80%, which is in line with the national polls at that time. And interestingly, what we find is the effect is pretty much linear, right? It's not that those who are in the middle all kind of sweep towards Putin, but at each level of support we find kind of an intercept shift to the right, which I think is really fascinating. We also found that the emotional kind of turmoil that was sweeping the nation was also very obvious in our group. We asked people on a 1 to 7 scale how much pride they felt in Russia's leadership. And what we found was that before Crimea, the answer was not very much. And after Crimea, the answer was a lot. So before Crimea, there was somewhere of the order of 15% of people would agree that they showed at least some pride, and only 2% said a lot. And then that had increased to nearly 40% after Crimea. So the educated urbanites were as involved in this big wave, this big rally around the flag effect as everybody else. What we did was we then tried to unpick different parts of this process. What was causing this big rally effect? And to summarize the results for you, basically there's 3 main factors that we find are really important in this. 2 of them are bottom-up, population-based factors, and then 1 is top-down. This is what Sam meant at the beginning when he talked about the political regime being co-constituted. So this is not just people being told what to think from above and everyone blindly following, but that there's demand for this kind of stuff coming from below. And these 3 factors, patriotism on the one hand and pride in the person of Putin, interact with state television, with propaganda from the top to produce this huge increase in support. Let me say a little bit more about each of these in turn. One of the big findings, and this fits with some work that Henry and Misha have done as well, that patriotism plays a big role in this. One of the things that happened around Crimea essentially was that patriots and nationalists who had not been terribly enthusiastic about the Putin regime became very enthusiastic about the Putin regime, and so they brought into this new sector of the population fully on board. We also found that people who watched more state television became more patriotic in this period. So not only were patriots who being brought in, but people were being turned on to patriotism. But that this effect was interesting. It wasn't a kind of, okay, unlike the pride it wasn't an overall everybody becomes more patriotic. It tended to be people who were already watching state television became more intense in their patriotism. And in fact, overall, we didn't find any real increase in levels of patriotism. We measured it in terms of a number of different things: association with the Orthodox Church, adherence to the Russian state, the Russian nation, or Russian culture. In terms of pride in the president, what we found was that those who expressed pride back in October were much more likely to rally to the leadership. And unlike patriotism, pride has increased across the board. But interestingly, pride in the leadership and patriotism seem to be pretty much unrelated from one another. The way I think about this as being two different currents in this stream, in this river of support, and they're actually separable and not that closely related to one another. So there's a personal effect, and then there's a patriotic effect. And then finally, as we all know, or all think we know, state television does have a big effect on approval. People who watched more state television before Crimea became much more patriotic, much more proud, and much more approving of the Putin regime between October and July. What's really interesting to me, though, is that this effect, though strong within this subgroup, is not across the board, because what happens is the state television was not able to attract a whole lot of new viewers. That the viewing pattern figures are actually pretty unchanged over the course of these two periods. We had a slight increase in the number of people that watched state TV daily, but the effect of reach of television is really limited by the sort of media selection effects that Sam was talking about. So to sum up, I'm going to sum up in two stages and talk about the regime support and then talk about what that implies for the future. The basic elements of regime support do include classical factors like economic performance, right? And let's not forget about that, because that I think is suspended temporarily for Crimea, but it's been a feature for a very long time. Another major feature of regime support in Russia is this desire for social acceptance. And as I mentioned, I think this is a very fluid feature and could change quickly. And that in the atmosphere of crisis around Crimea, there's been these other streams of patriotism, pride, and propaganda that have been brought in. Going forward, I think what we need to remember is this co-constitution. That the state is a player in this, but the Russian population is an active participant both in the construction of the opposition that Sam talked about and of the regime that I focused on. And so we need to, if we're thinking about how long things are going to go, we need to think about the regime as not being entirely in control of this process, and there being unexpected forces from society coming up. Consequently, if you think about these kind of rally effects that we've seen, this really does look like a classical rally effect that you saw in the United States around 9/11, that Margaret Thatcher had around the Falklands era. And what we've learned from those processes is that the uniformity of messaging is really important. Once the public starts to hear different messages coming from different parts of the elite, then these bubbles in popularity burst and go away. And so one of the priorities for the regime is going to be maintaining elite unity around the message. The other thing that we know is that once the public stops thinking the security threat is real and serious, then the bubble goes away. And so, somewhat scarily, I think.
Just close that.
Good afternoon. First, I would like to say thank you for Samuel for inviting me to today's workshop and tomorrow conference. I'm not a scientific person at all. I'm now working for Yegor Gaidar Foundation to organize the public lectures and seminars and for many years I write the columns for Russian periodicals which are conducted by foreign companies, the monthly Forbes and daily business newspaper Ведомости, the owners of which are Wall Street Journal and Financial Times. So the remarks from me can be seen like the remarks from a scientific person, but from someone who observes the politics in Russia. The paper, the very interesting paper of Samuel and Graeme, summarizes the findings about how the ideological and political contestation returned to the Russian political landscape after September 2011, when Vladimir Putin announced he would return to Russian presidency. The main advantage of the article, I think, is tracking how the Russian participated in opposition activity from the winter of 2011 to the summer 2015. What encouraged supporters of the opposition and what prevent them from the activity participation in the protest action. Chapter 1 describes the Kremlin's turn from peace to war, like they said, from Medvedev's modernization to the rise of coercion against the opposition, against the media, against NGOs and civic groups in the recent years. Agreeing with this description, I would like to add a very important point. I think the political regime in Russia doesn't become authoritarian per second in September 2011. The evolution of Putin's regime towards authoritarianism has been gradual, consistent and continuous. The method Putin came to power and his first action when he took power had left no doubts. In the 90s, the democracy and capitalism in Russia was defeated, and in 1999, the security forces came to power, which would be, and they would like to restore order, like they said. The destruction of independent TV in 2000 year, following the exile of Gusinsky, Grozovsky, have shown that Putin sees the control over TV like the key condition of his power. Of course, in that time, the opposition in Russia then was very weak and didn't have any influence at all. Many were hoping that Putin will improve the business environment without destroying the democratic competition and free speech. But there were serious doubts in it then too. When Khodorkovsky was arrested and Putin refused to talk with the leaders of the civil society on this subject, and when in 2004 Putin cancelled the election of governors on the pretext of the fight against terrorism, and the need to strengthen the power vertical. At that time, the last doubts about what for Putin came to power, I think, disappeared. Despite the tax cut and improving the business climate in the first years of Putin's first presidency, the country was gradually moving to the crony capitalism model. Therefore, in my view, it's wrong to talk about the events of the year 2011 as about a radical change in the trend. A more reasonable is to consider first the establishment of control over TV 10 years before as a prototype of what will happen in the field of freedom of speech after Russia have annexed Crimea, and there is more reasonable to consider the war with Georgia and the de facto annexation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 28 year as a pattern of what Russia did 6 years later in the Crimea and Donbass region. Another example, Putin think that the NGO British Council works against Russia not today but 10 years ago too, and the Kremlin was trying to shut this NGO in 10 years ago. Perhaps 2011 was the point of no return for Putin as the authoritarian leader, and after that Putin have lost the opportunity to return to a democratic and capitalist model of development. But until that year, Russia was very close to that point too. The key moment in the growth of confrontation with the outside world and in the evolution of the regime to an authoritarian mode of action were to establish state control over TV. In the case of Yukos and Khodorkovsky 12 years ago, and the rising of state-owned companies in the years of 26, 28. And the war with Georgia 7 years ago. Therefore, I would say that the maximum concentration of political power in the hands of Putin and the consolidation of economic power in his hands, in the hands of his friends, was a constant intention and the deliberate strategy of the Kremlin since 1999. Unfortunately, civil society in Russia had realized where the country is moving only in 2011, 12 years after. During the 4 previous years when Medvedev was a president, many have had totally unjustified, I think, unjustified hopes for gradual political and economic evolution of the country towards a modern society. However, the events that I have listed above actually determined the reaction of the Kremlin on the opposition protests. Kremlin's reaction to opposition activities in the recent years were, I think, predetermined by one simple fact. The purpose of Putin policy is and was only to maximize his reign in time and maximize the power in his hands. The achievement of this objective involves the removal of all threats to Putin's leadership, both external and internal threats. So I oppose that is not quite correct to speak about the political situation in Russia until 2011 as about old regime, and after 2011 as about new regime that replaced the old one. On the contrary, the political regime has remained the same, I think, but in 2011 and 2012 years, it was faced with new threats to its existence. This caused Putin to go to the strategy of mass mobilization, the apogee of which was the annexation of Crimea, and to politics of further restricting the activities of his opponents, up to eliminating them as it was with Boris Nemtsov. Of course, some part of the elite has good wishes addressed to Medvedev even in summer of 2011. This was this strategy for him, which prepared by the Institute of Contemporary Development in Russia. But seriously, to believe in the realization of such scenarios was impossible even then. Those who read Putin's intention to remain in power have been subjected to repression 10 years ago, as like as 7 years ago. Okay, I would lost some remarks. So what happened in 2011 is the final clarification of the nature of the Putin's regime for Russian citizens and for external observers. And second, the divergence between the Putin's goal to stay in power as long as possible, and from one side, and the benefits of economic development of the country from the other side. Before that year, the economic development of the country had helped Putin to buy the loyalty of elites and ordinary citizens as well. After that, it became apparent that educated and affluent citizens will not put up with Putin's intention to remain in power for his entire life. Therefore, from that year, to bet on economic growth would be a mistake for Putin, and he doesn't do this mistake. The economic growth gradually undermined his ability to retain power, because over time more and more people would getting rich and visiting foreign countries and so on. They would deal not only with ensuring their survival, but they would be engaged in the civic activities, including opposition activity. So the former political flexibility of Putin before the year 2011 is only a function, I think, of the absence of protest activity in the country, and the absence of the protest activity is, in its turn, a function of misunderstanding from citizens of the true nature of Putin's regime. The chapter 2 portrays the rising of opposition and key actors of this movement. The authors analyzes the engagement in the protest activity through the membership in Facebook and activity of Facebook users and in communities which devoted to protests. This allowed to draw a quite clear picture of the protest movement. However, if it would be said about a few pitfalls of such an analysis. First, you would take into account the behavior of users of Facebook, one of which I'm The analysis of network participation in the chapter 2 traces the action of Facebook users in the several communities. But there are Facebook communities having a different nature. For example, the communities we were at Bolotnaya Square and communities, the white tape of protest, were designed to gather people on one or two concrete protest actions. For the most of opposition, the most communities don't function as a permanent community where the people read news and communicate about what is happening now. The nature of the communities like Ruсь сидящая, Russia in prison, or Transparency International Russia, about which Samuel and Graeme were writing, is different, I think. These organizations are dedicated to solving relevant problems, the fight against corruption and assistance in detention, people in detention. But people are taking part in the activities of such organizations not through the membership in their communities and not through the activity in them. Rather, they subscribe to a feed from the leaders of these communities, Olga Romanova and Elena Panfilova, respectively. And they read their recordings, likes them, comments them, shares them, and help this organization outside the Facebook. As for me personally, I try regularly to help the work of Olga Romanova organization, but never served in this community and never was active in it. To track my sympathy for this organization through Facebook, you can only analyze personal interaction between me and Romanova, likes, comments, sharings, etc., but not by analyzing activity in the community, Russia in prison. I think many other people are just like me. Personally, I am online in Facebook at least 2 hours per day, and my activity is not private. However, I rarely take part in the activities of any groups and any communities in Facebook. Many people are the same. So it's very difficult to say that only one person of those who were at Bolotnaya Square 2 years later took part in anti-war march based on the analysis of the activities in relevant communities. Another example is the protest against Russian Orthodox Church construction in Tarfyanka Park, about which Sam was saying about. As for me, I have spent my childhood near this park, and my mother lives here now, and I took part in 2 meetings against the construction and signed several petitions against it. And I posted 1 or 2 times in Facebook against the construction, but I knew only from the article of Samuel and Graeme that the protesters against the construction have the community in Facebook. I didn't know it before. 30 seconds. Okay. Chapter 3. Contains very interesting finding about the personal trait, agreeableness, as a very good predictor of the opposition activity in Russia. I believe that this intuition is correct, and the mechanism here is the exposure of people to the government brainwashing by TV. The agreeable people would agree with what the government are telling them. Or maybe they decide not to protest, even in the case they don't believe government, as far as they think the political regime is strong enough and any protest activity is prohibited or may affect their career and well-being. But this approach leaves one unsolved puzzle, I think. Why agreeableness is such a common trait between Russians? Why are it reproduced as well in 1970s in USSR and in the modern Russia too? And what do influence on the dynamics of the agreeableness? Here I have two suggestions. First, suppose the analysis of the value structure and its dynamics can help here. There are numerous articles from which we can see that people in Russia are afraid to deal with life's difficulties without help from state. They don't trust other people, and they don't trust even themselves, don't believe in their own abilities to improve the world around them. I think that's what makes them so obedient and agreeable. The second is we need to understand how the stimulus are working when the government is to punish the people for the non-agreeableness and to reward them for the agreeableness and conformity. They become agreeable. The situation will change only when the stimulus will work in the reverse order, when to agree with the political regime will be not profitable for people as it was in 1990 and 1991 years. Thank you very much.
I think we've heard very, very interesting and rich presentations. Regina Smyth started by saying that it is easy to be cynical about the situation with the Russian opposition. I would say it is easy to be despondent or even depressed, and this is what we heard from Boris just now. And this is indeed a pervasive perception in the Russian circles who used to be hopeful back only a few years ago. Now, what indeed we heard was fairly rich, and I think that the combination that what we heard in the presentations about the dynamics and the legitimacy and the history of the opposition movement, if this is the way we should call it, and I will speak a little bit about that later. The very interesting part of Sam's and Graeme's work about the internet and television and how the preference for one or the other affects public perceptions, as well as this dynamics of the internet exchange and the social networks. I think it's an immense contribution to the understanding of the phenomenon of the opposition, that it is a changeable and movable target. And I think that was part of what Sam was talking, and I think it's really, really important because we've seen over these past years quite different manifestations of what may be called protest activity or indeed opposition movement, or in fact, I think because it's such a changeable and movable target, it's really hard to think of one term to apply to it. And I don't think opposition is actually the most apt term to be applied. Graeme's presentation on what factors define the perceptions and agreeability. For some reason, Graeme, you used social acceptance more in your oral presentation, but in the paper it's more agreeability, and I think Do you think it is the same or not? I think it's an interesting question. And factors such as patriotism, etc., that also help us understand the 80+% factor, and indeed the vast, impressive shift in the public perceptions that Graeme also spoke about and that we all know, the difference, the change from 60+% approval rating for Putin to 80+% approval rating. I think the factor of the aspect of history, this very short history and a very rich history of what we call the opposition movement, or however we should call it, which begins in 2011 and in fact earlier than that, is also important to understand what we're dealing with here. And I think that the root cause, or rather the roots of what became the protests and what drove many observers to call it opposition was a rise in civic activism. And there we should go back to at least 2009, 2010, and of course the one of the first and maybe the first climax was 2010 and what happened during the forest fires in Russia. And this is when we realized that what was at play in Russia during the years of Putin's of 10 democracy, of Medvedev's presidency, was actually a process of social modernization. A combination of several factors contributed. It was the relative prosperity. It was very fast penetration of the internet and social networks. It was the, I would say, verbal freedom of the time when Medvedev was president. And also the rise of post-industrial economy in Russia, and all that converged in what I would certainly describe as social modernization in many different ways. And the uninformed infatuation with the West that was the case in the Soviet Union in very late stages of this union gave way to what I would say informed appraisal of what West was about and then to Westernization. What the social modernization produced, among other things, was a taste for civic activism in quite different forms. And in the paper, in Graeme's paper, you talk about different kinds of anti-regime activity. I would add that not just anti-regime, all kind of charity and environmentalism and all kinds of other forms of activism. People developed, people of a certain community, I think, Graeme, you called them what, educated urbanites? Okay, this is one way to describe it. They developed this taste, and it was became very broadly popular among this constituency to engage in that. And in working on all kinds of projects, they developed a sense of we can. If there's a problem, we'll get at it and we'll solve it. They were individual civic problems, and they were able to solve them. And this is why 2010, when the rescue operation by the public was much more efficient than the eventually, of course, bungled rescue operation of the state. It was the skills of organization, the skills of management, the skills of exchanging the information, of skills of knowing how to use what the modern world had to offer in terms of dissemination of information. And I think with these skills and with this baggage, this constituency arrived in 2011, and we know what happened, and they were able to use these skills for the protests. Now, it may be true, and I would not disagree with what Boris was talking about, that in fact the regime never changed, and we can find traces of the same instincts and traces, same factors, as far back as 2002 or maybe even 2001. But we didn't have the social modernization. That was new. And I think we may look at and we may actually mourn the decline of activism and the way the regime responded, but I don't think it's entirely gone. And what we are dealing with today, and the fact that Regina started with saying it's sweet but still strong, right? And there's certainly a lot for scholars like yourselves to look at. I don't believe that social modernization can be fully destroyed. I think it probably can be, but it takes a cultural revolution, China style, not the kind of regime that we are having today. It is a very interesting question of where all these people are, and I mean, is there a chance, is there a reason to hope for a resurgence? And I don't think anybody has an answer for that, and there are different theories, and I will use this opportunity to advertise my new publication a little bit. Kirill Rogov's piece in my journal that will appear very soon is exactly about this, and I think what he offers as an explanation is original, and I haven't seen it anybody else. And I will keep you intrigued. Please read my journal. I think that we should, because I don't believe opposition is a good term. I think it describes only a small part of it. Two factors that we should look at. Permissiveness of the government, which plays a huge role, and broad public demand. Because when at the peak of the protests, of course, the numbers in the streets were still very low by the standards of Russia, with its 140 million people. But the number of people who sympathized was about 1/3. People who sympathized with Russia without Putin. And that's quite something. But then, of course, it didn't last. And we had, if we summarize, anyway, from Putin, who had over 80% at the time of relative prosperity, being Putin the uniter, by actually enabling the nation to be relaxed. Let's put it this way. Then he became Putin the divider, when his approval rating went down to 60%. And then he became, again, Putin the uniter with over 80%. Now, do we go from here to Putin the divider again? If we do, it will be a different story, different from the previous stage, because those 60 plus were the result of permissiveness, and there's no chance of new permissiveness anytime soon. So if we go from here to this opposition, or whatever you call it, getting more active, I think the foundation for it, the factors will be different. And there is certainly the factor of the public demand, which we should not underestimate. 1/3 of the population saying in public opinion polls that we share the line Russia without Putin means demand. We don't have it now. And this is something that should not be underestimated. In this broad realm, which we can call opposition or however, we should differentiate between opinion, or the opinion that we can actually see in public opinion polls, the desire to express yourself in any way, activism, and the ability to reach out to broader public. I think this is a continuum of sorts. The difference in opinion is still there. And we see this. I think, Sam, you were talking about the perception of various government's initiatives, and legislative and otherwise, anti-gay legislation, if I'm allowed the informal description, the ban and adoption of Russian orphans abroad, and the anti-Magnitsky law. The immediate perception was different. The anti-gay was immediately met with broadest possible approval. The Magnitsky Act, not the anti-Magnitsky Act, but the Magnitsky Act, I think many of you should remember, people regard it as positive development, as America helping Russians to fight their corrupt officials. It is hard to believe these days, but this was true. And the ban on adoption was not only received differently by different groups of Russian society, but this was a unique occasion in Russia. when Putin had to face unfriendly questions. And a series of them, one reporter after another at his gala press conference was asking the same question, and the questions were unfriendly. So, and of course, even educated urbanites with time accepted both the ban on adoption and came to regard the Magnitsky Act totally differently. And there emerged a unanimity. But right now, just these days, the extermination of food evoked the difference in opinion. And so did the release on parole of Vasilyeva, who barely spent 1 month in custody and was released. So the difference in opinion is there even today with 80 plus. It does not, it cannot express itself in anything that's action because of the lack of permissiveness and because of, okay, yeah, I'll finish right now. And because the demand is very limited. And finally, I will, I have two questions to two factors that Graeme was talking about. One is patriotism, the other is agreeability. Patriotism I have a problem with how you, not with how you define patriotism, but the kind of questions you cite that you ask people to elicit patriots as opposed to non-patriots. And they were, in my view, very straightforward questions. Do you associate with Russian culture, Russian state, Russian something? There were 3 or 4, right? I think there could be, these are all almost, it's almost the definition. Of course, if you are Russian, and the church, right? It was also the church. I think these are 2 obvious questions. And it's almost incorrect to say I am Russian, but I do not associate with the Orthodox religion, and I do not associate with Russian culture. The state is a different issue. I think it would be very interesting to elicit in your questions how people view patriotic as opposed to not patriotic. And I think this is something to think about. And agreeability, I think it would be very interesting to discuss just what the word actually means in English. Is it the opposite of a conflicting personality who likes conflict? Because frankly, I don't see much difference between agreeability as you describe it and acquiescence. Agreeable people who like unanimity draw on the government to condemn, suppress, deport, and do things that are not agreeable at all. Or maybe I misunderstand the word. So I would be really interested to hear what you say.
Okay, thank you. So we have some time for questions. What I propose is just to take as many questions from the audience as we have time for, and then we'll turn to the panelists for a set of responses before we conclude. Yes, Sufjan, if you could just identify yourself, please.
Sufjan from Robertson University. I have a question for Regina. I really like the approach because all I hear from Russia is so depressing. But you see there's a positive thing, and this opposition you see not just a marginalized group, but as a political force. So my question.
Thank you. So my question is, when you describe opposition that participated in this local elections and may participate in federal elections as a positive force and as a political force, could you could you expand more a little bit about the domestic political impact of this opposition and on the impact of opposition position on foreign policy of contemporary regime. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yes.
Do we have time for comments as well? Or for
I think if they're very brief, maybe 1 minute. So we can wait for the microphone here. Eileen.
Nikolai Petrov. Well, first of all, could you please tell what's the status of your 50 plus something pages report? Should it be published in full, or it will be a book, or? Oh, okay. Well, I'll start with saying that I do like this very much, and I'm not satisfied with the whole bunch of numerous publications on protests because they do not draw the picture precisely. It's simplistic, and in your piece, the historic part is simplistic as well. There are two major actors, the Kremlin and society. And there are two other very important actors which are not described, political elites and regional elites, first of all, and observers. And without observers, there would be no protest, because in Russia, and this is another mistake, here at the West, perception is that Russians did protest against bad or fraudulent elections. Elections do not play any role, and nobody would protest against elections. If only there would be not so numerous observers, and if only they would not feel humiliated by how they were treated, then protest would be absent. And Putin is absolutely right when he is trying to push out observers, and any elections, and recent elections in a year from now, would not cause any essential protest. So the second thing, and I'll be brief, is that I think you are very positive with regard to Russian society, and you do describe that this is situational and everything can change in a very short while. I think Russian society is drunk, and it's not that easy to keep it in this capacity, but not only it's drunk, it's poisoned. And what we can describe as a result of Weimar syndrome is the origin of another Weimar syndrome for the next generation. And when Putin is over, Russian society will remain not that good as it used to be before protests, but much worse, and it will take decades before society will become capable to do something. So my last question is to all participants: how do you see scenarios in which protests can either take place in near future, or what will happen to them? Thank you.
Good. Other comments, questions? All right. So I think we have 5 presenters and about 14, maybe 15 minutes you could squeeze. So I think if you could try to keep your remarks. I know there's a lot to address, to 3 minutes each or less. I guess we could just, okay, well, aim for 3. We can give you a couple more if you want. So maybe we'll start with Regina and then go to Sam and Graeme, and we'll give our commentators some time to respond as well.
So I think it's a sad day when we say the presence of an opposition, and here I agree, the term is a very variegated set of actors. So you have some organization, and I would argue, and hopefully we'll talk about this, that organization does matter somewhat, right? So who actually frames is an important question, right? To me, it's an important question. Who coordinated observers is an extraordinarily important question. So organization does matter, and very small organizations sometimes matter. Not, Sufyan, because they are politically relevant right now, but because they're relevant in the sense that they are providing the only information, the only alternative source of information, and that different sources of information and different actions provide very different touchstones, right? So we say this word political trust all the time. But really, political trust means something very precise. It means that I trust my leader to act in my interest, right? And observers let us know that the leaders weren't acting in their interest. In fact, they were taking their power. So you can start to think a little bit across issue areas of when it's easier or less easy to perceive the leader as acting in your interest, right? When the leader is destroying food, the leader's not acting at your interest, and there was no lack of very quick response despite an information dearth, right? And so I think we need to think more precisely about what it means in that context. So I would say that they have very little direct political relevance at the moment, but that doesn't mean that they're not an important actor in shaping things like coordinating these civic organizations and linking them together, in creating common political frames, and in trying to shift again or reclaim the agenda from sort of a Putin-friendly agenda to a Putin non-friendly agenda, to refocus on the economy. They have almost zero influence at the moment on foreign policy. I'm not sure, and presumably other people will talk about it, but I think almost no one has any influence over foreign policy. But let me just say one thing about a small disagreement that maybe Graeme and Sam and I have, which is just like these attitudes or personalities, just like politics are co-created, so are these attitudes and personalities, or at least the trends or the way they manifest. So you're polling at exactly the moment that the Kremlin moves very aggressively to use things like moral panic to define in and out groups and to circumscribe acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And so it's not only the receptivity of it, but the new toolkit, the new authoritarian toolkit, is really using symbolic politics and these symbolic ideas to circumscribe political behavior and speech. And I think that's really clear, and people are in part responding to that. Or at least that's what we see.
Okay, great, thanks, yeah. Sam.
So I'll start by saying that I think that's exactly right, and I think that it's mutual construction. It's construction of societal reaction, it's construction of regime reaction, and it's iterative, so it's constantly being produced and reproduced. And I think at the end of the day, Masha, to your question, right, is opposition the best term to use? And may our grant givers forgive us since it's in the title of the grant, but at the end of the day, I think opposition isn't actually what we're writing about. It's about contestation, and that you very clearly have a regime that has certain goals it's trying to achieve, right, and is finding its way towards the achievement of those goals, and you've got a society that has both a certain amount of desire for and a certain amount of capacity for resistance, rather, you've got citizens that have a certain amount of capacity and desire for resistance, and they look for strategies of coping with that, and there are many different ways that can happen. So I think that when we look at the very micro level story having to do with personalities and emotions and things, that we're looking at what's happening on the level of, as close as we can get to it, of an individual in a person's mind, right? And then there's the question of how does that then get aggregated at the level of a collective response? How does then the state shape the landscape for collective response? And also provide political opportunity structures, and this gets into things like that Nikolai was talking about in terms of elites and the much more complex picture of actors, and I agree that we need to make that more problematic. I think there are a couple of other just brief things I would say. Masha, you were talking about social modernization, and you can probably predict what I'm going to say, but I've written before about individual modernization. I don't like Graeme and I haven't discussed this, so I don't know whether we agree. But I tend to think that what you described in the Medvedev period was a period in which individuals were modernizing, right? And so individuals were going out in what was still a very atomized social structure, right? And getting involved in the internet, traveling, in some cases, right, getting jobs in something like a high-tech sector, right, or an internet cluster in Moscow, but it was never big enough to create the kinds of of reinforcing social effects that Silicon Valley creates, or that kind of thing that you have around here. Now, it takes time, right? But I think it's not quite the same thing to say that, yes, the creation of a cohort of modernized individuals brings modernized forms and practices into society, but that's not the same thing necessarily as social modernization. That it allows for the introduction of these kinds of things like the response to the forest fires, right, which throws down a challenge to other citizens, right, which throws down a challenge to the regime to a certain extent. But it's not to say that this becomes even necessarily a self-reproducing form in Russia. And when we've seen the recent fires around Baikal, for example, look at the health map, it's not there, right, it's not happening again. Well, that may be an issue, right? But that is not projected as easily as the frames and the sort of the ideas of resistance.
From an ongoing research project that will result in a book. There will be very shortly, I hope, a sort of 40-page version of it that's going to be on our website, and hopefully on PONARS website too. And then taking into people's comments about history, which are absolutely well founded, I think. We need to work much more on putting this in context. A book will emerge. And so these comments are extremely helpful for that. Just on a few specifics that people asked about. Sam's addressed modernization. We talked a lot about that. In terms of patriotism, I agree these questions are too straightforward. And what I wanted to see was more variation across questions. And we do get quite a lot of variation across questions. For example, people's connection with Russian culture is quite different from their connection with Orthodoxy. So they're correlated in the 0.3, 0.4 area. So they are catching on different kinds of things. We asked them not just, are you, to what extent are you a member of these different categories, but also how important is that membership to you? So we did get a certain amount of variation across those things, but it would have been great to have kind of more sort of, I don't know, kind of quiz questions that we could have asked to get a more indirect approach, and to do that if someone else gives us more money. Do it again. This question of agreeableness, one of the things that we've been doing over the last year or so is trying to perform a translation exercise between a fairly technical field of social science called psychology and something that as a political scientist would find more meaningful and understandable. And so this agreeableness is the term in the paper, is a term, it's a technical term in psychology. And what it really means is a number of different things, but one of the things it really means is a desire for social acceptance, which people talk about as being a combination of politeness and compassion. Right? And so, and how those different things interact has been studied in some detail. So in the paper, I called it, social acceptance, but you can actually go through this in some more detail.
So, that's Russian.
Yeah, what's the Russian question that you would ask them?
Got that somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can talk about it later.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in essence, what the effort to do is to try and get the degree to which people are sympathetic for others and also don't want to work with them. And those actually behave slightly differently. In terms of scenarios for when protests could take place and the role of observers, I 100% agree that the observers are absolutely crucial the last time. I also remember very clearly in the summer and early fall of 2011 saying, thinking that there was going to be significant protests around the Duma elections, but at no point did it occur to me that the observers with whom I was working at the time were going to be part of that process. And so I think that was kind of a surprise to everyone, because the emergence of the new observer organizations and the way that citizens got into that rather than just being kind of goalless on its own, doing basically the same stuff that they had been doing for a decade. And so the lesson I take from that is that these things are, to use Mark Bassinger's terms, eventful. History is eventful, and we're surprised by what things happen. And so it's very hard to predict scenarios where they're quite specific. But I do think that something surprising will happen, and people will gather around it, and it's not going to be a generation. I don't think.
Do you mean positive surprises or negative?
Boris, Masha, you brief.
Okay. Very quickly. Without elections, there wouldn't be observers. right? This is not just a play on words. I think elections are still important, even if they don't make any difference politically, because in general, if the government wants to keep people subdued, then the elections works counter to their intention. No matter how controlled, egregiously rigged, whatever, still, instead of telling them, keep away from politics, we don't want you to make noises, they actually drive people to do something, to come to the, to cast their ballots. And this produces observers. So without elections, there would be no observers. And it's not, in this sense, even though you are, of course, right that elections have been entirely eviscerated, they still matter. And this is what we've been talking about after the elections in September. Sam, I mean, I totally agree with individual and organization, but it was, what I was talking about is charity, and this is exactly doing for others. And among other things that those people learned how to do and developed a taste for was working for other people. And there was this sense we achieved for ourselves. We're well-educated, urbanized people. We are no worse than our Western counterparts in our professions and otherwise. If we achieve for ourselves, we can do something for others. And charity was immensely popular. What was true about this educated urbanites was that they were not political, but they were very fond of social projects, because a project is something limited in time and with a very concrete goal, and you work toward this goal, and sometimes you achieve. And the time between 2009 2011, they achieved many times. Observers is one of those projects that they undertook. They knew how to organize. They knew they were very proud of being good organizers and good managers and good at exchanging information. And they achieved a lot. And then, of course, they were terribly insulted when they were treated in such an unromantic manner. Contestation is really a very good word. And but Regina, you were talking about opposition, so I think we still need to find a term for that. Contestation, I think, is a really good one. There was one more thing I wanted to say. What this constituency, this community, or whatever you call it, produces is good professionals, something like Annie Volker. This is a very limited group of people who are very good at what they are doing. And it is the same, if we look back a little bit, as it was with non-government organizations. This community produced very good professionals who knew exactly what they were doing, how to do it. They learned all the skills that first were offered to them by their foreign trainees. But what it did not produce is a broad environment. Here we come to the lack of social organization. And come to think of it, it's also true of much broader issues in Russia. This, I'm not sure what the right English language term is, or штучное производство, single piece, whatever you call it. In Russia, we're very good at producing a very limited number of very good things, or very talented individuals. What we're not good at, and have never been, is mass production. And I think it applies to social processes as well as to production of commodities.
Boris? Okay. All right. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for a really interesting discussion. And,